Dr. Srini Pillay is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He is known for combining head and heart, figuratively and literally, in an approach to personal development and goal mastery that blends science, spirituality, and the joy of life to combat the stresses faced by ambitious and high-achieving people in academia, business, and life. After graduating at the top of his class from medical school in South Africa, he received a Medical Research Council scholarship to study the neurochemistry of panic. He completed his residency at psychiatry at McLean Hospital with the most accolades ever given to a single student. Srini also completed fellowships in psychopharmacology, structural brain imaging, and functional brain imaging. He was director of the Outpatient Anxiety Disorders Program at McLean Hospital and was director of Panic Disorders Research Program in the Brain Imaging Center. There, he spent 17 years studying functional brain imaging. During this time, he maintained an active clinical practice, which he continues today. As a member of the Disasters and the World Committee, Srini's contributions include, but are not limited to, 2 chapters in a book called Disaster Psychiatry.
Welcome back to the Collective Trauma Summit. My name is Thomas. I'm the organizer of the summit, and I have the real pleasure to sit here today with Srini Pillay. Hello, Srini.
Hi, Thomas. Lovely to see you.
It's lovely to see you. I still remember our last conversation, which became actually a highlight of last year's summit. And I know that we went like a roller coaster all over the place, and it was really lovely. And that's also what I really enjoy about every conversation. Since our first conversation that we had, I don't know, some years ago, there's always the unexpected, creative, and very energizing flow of your being. And so I really appreciate sitting here today with you, and that we together see how we kind of dive into, of course, the overarching frame is collective trauma, and how we sit in a web of trauma that has been here for thousands and maybe hundreds of thousands of years, and how we are trying to find our way through it. And since your amazing neuroscience and psychiatry background, maybe you can give us some illumination around how our brain is coping with all the trauma history of humanity. So I'm very happy to be here with you. And I went today through a little bit of your bio, and then there was one thing that I even didn't know about, and that is disaster psychiatry. And then I said, what is disaster psychiatry? And then you wrote, I think, 2 chapters in a book. And maybe since I'm interested now what that is, maybe we start there, and seems to be connected to our summit, it seems.
Yeah, well, we keep on. So I belong to a group of people. It's a think tank in psychiatry in the U.S. And I belong to a group with the group is called the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry, GAP. And we have a number of different committees addressing a bunch of different ideas. And so the committee that I landed on really was one that was initially called the Disaster Psychiatry Group. And then its name has evolved into Disaster, Trauma, and Global Mental Health. And essentially, what we do is we work, all of us, from a number of different perspectives on the issues, psychological issues related to disaster, trauma, and global mental health. So on that committee are people who are regularly responding to earthquakes, to pandemics, to any kind of disaster anywhere in the world. They are either themselves going to those places or rallying people. Then there are people who work in emergency departments who have that perspective. And there are people who work in anxiety, like myself, and also think about the brain. So we put things together, and when we are at these conferences, we come together to discuss either contemporary issues or ways in which we can begin to have conversations with the public to be able to share the depth and breadth of expertise. So the depth and breadth of expertise is around Disasters, Trauma, and Global Mental Health. And this is a think tank on which we think about these issues. So it's very relevant to today and what we're talking about, because I think, over the years, when you start thinking about collective trauma, you think about suddenly trauma as a diagnosis, or you think about it as a situation, either an intrapersonal situation or an interpersonal situation, or something that's happening in the brain or something that's happening outside the brain. And I think more and more, for me, one of the things about trauma to think about, and certainly some of this thinking has come from this committee, is to see trauma as a driver for change. And I was thinking about this before our talk today. And I was thinking, as I told you, I've been composing music, and I wrote a country song yesterday. And I was feeling in a very sort of non-trauma oriented mode. So I was like, what would I do to get myself into a place of empathy? And I was like, actually, there's no problem at all. Because I think the non-trauma modes are always talking to the trauma modes all the time. And in the book chapters that we're talking about, one big issue that came up for us was whether debriefing is helpful. Like, is it helpful to tell the story of your trauma, either personal or, as you understand it, collectively? And I just made I looked at the research, and I saw that actually the research showed that either it is not, there's a thing called critical incident stress debriefing, which is basically, if something has occurred, like you've been involved in a fire or a volcano or an attack of some kind, should you be talking about that over and over again? And one issue that came up was debriefing, and the research showed that either it had no effect or it had negative effects. And when you start to look at why it might have a negative effect, it's because of a term that I've actually coined called hippocampal hammering. So the hippocampus is where the memories are stored and processed. And if you keep on talking about the trauma, you keep on hammering the memory in, then you develop an attachment to that memory, because that memory becomes your first thought. And so even though I made a brief mention in the initial round of the book, it was peer reviewed by a group of experts, and they all came back with remove debriefing. There should be the only statement about debriefing should be debriefing is not helpful. And while I think that's true about the research shows that it's much more helpful to focus on the recovery mechanisms and to focus on the healing part and to focus on that. I think initially people were tense about the fact that they thought that not speaking about it after the first event, it's not about suppressing it, it's just not speaking about it over and over again, is somehow a denial of what happened. And in the popular press, everyone is always talking about how you should describe your trauma, talk about your difficulty over and over again. And I think there's a relief when you hear the story, but relief in itself is not homogeneous. There are some forms of relief that are helpful, and there are some forms of relief, like being stuck in a habit pattern, which causes a lot of relief, that is not helpful. And so if you are caught in the habit of reporting without also simultaneously focusing on healing, you may not actually have the opportunity to be in this healing mode. So one of the things I think we talked about in these chapters was the fact that that actually the recovery from trauma has more to do with resilience building than it has to do with hippocampal hammering. Mm-hmm. And I think over time, what I've realized is that it's not as linear as that. Because I think suppression and repression, like if you're saying, okay, I'm not supposed to talk about the trauma, so now let me just only focus on my resilience. If you are suppressing that, it actually has negative effects on your mind and your body as well. So that when you are repressing or suppressing, the fear center in your brain becomes even more hyperactive. because there's this tension and your amygdala starts becoming even more active. But what's, I think, particularly interesting about that is that it doesn't only affect your amygdala, it actually affects the rest of your body. So there are correlations between these suppressions and repressions and cardiac problems and even cancer. So it seems like cells and even organs like the heart do not respond in a friendly way to information that is being forcibly restrained. Yet, on the other hand, we know that to be stuck in the habit is also not helpful. So, I would say one of the questions this then brings us to is what is the seemingly intangible zone between the habit of talking about the trauma and the negative part about suppressing it? The answer is not to always talk about it. It's not even to sometimes talk about it. It is in part to focus on the resilience. How do you focus on the resilience without mentioning the trauma? And I think there the opportunity is to make the connection between the problem and the solution and to see them as one, the microcosm. And once you see the problem and the solution as one, that they are in active communication with each other all the time. Like one of the things I've learned from running an anxiety disorder service is how often people would have the same trauma repeated either in the same way or in different contexts. I'm rejected from my relationship, I'm rejected from my work, I'm rejected by the weather. I went out, I thought it was going to be sunny, then it started to rain. It's like everywhere I go, like I'm expecting to flourish, but I cannot flourish. And I think part of this has to do with not understanding wholeness. So I think in my response to you, really, what I'm saying is that we've been looking at disasters, looking at trauma and mental health, looking at the tension between talking versus not talking. And I think that's where I would sort of present that back to you and sort of ask you what you think about this tension between speaking about the trauma versus focusing on the healing, and how you would suggest people navigate that space.
I completely agree. I also have like totally resonate when you say that if you are just hammering it, so you're actually just reinforcing something inside. I don't think that's helpful. For me, it seems like that's through the work with many groups and clients. What I'm saying now, that's not kind of research based like you speak about it. But when I sit with people, how it looks to me is that every time people speak about the trauma, I call it an inner architecture of like the embodied part, like the physical part, the physical stress, the emotional structure, the mental framing, and the relational dimension become visible or palpable. Like I can feel it and see that how people store that event in a way within their nervous system. And so when we don't just talk about it, but when we use it just as a tracking device to come to the hyperactivation, the stress, the numbness, and do that in a related field, then I have the feeling the relation provides some kind of like nervous system's resonance that seems to decrease the stress levels, seems to open up numb parts, like lead to kind of it seems like often that the trauma is like a fragmentation on a certain level of development. And when there is a like such a healing space provided, the ripped apart or the split parts come together and create a vertical uprising of energy that starts to become a kind of an evolutionary step. So it seems to me that one part of the client relaxes and one part of the client opens up a future that is wider than the one that was there before. like as you said, like I feel rejected here, I feel rejected there, and suddenly it seems like, oh, there are moments I like the rejection gets less and the striving gets more. So I would always relate it back to the if it's used as a tracking device or if it's used as a story. And I think if it's used as a story, it's not helpful at all, because it's kind of like a circuit inside, as you said. That's also my experience when I sit with people. But the relational field makes a big difference, I believe. It brings it more, the past, closer to the present moment. So that's, in a way, how it appears to me, what you said. It's very congruent with what you described, it seems.
Well, another piece of biology that I think relates to what you just said is that in the brain, the circuits that code for the past overlap with the circuits that code for the present and for the future. So in the brain, the past, present, and future are not divided into time zones cleanly. They are all interacting. So, for example, when you are imagining something about the future, one of the areas that activates is the memory center. You're like, why is the memory center activating when I'm imagining about the future? It's because memories are one of the places where you store templates, where you turn to in order you create, you get stuff from memory to be able to construct a future in part. So that's the one brain related thing I would say about that. The other, which I think I am finding more and more, is that behind the story or the report of the trauma is a language. And people in our society have an over reliance on language to understand meaning. And one way we understand this is from studies of people with global aphasia. So if you have a stroke or you have a brain, some kind of lesion that makes it impossible to speak and impossible to understand language, you might think you're not intelligent, you're not able to figure something out. But what's interesting is studies show that if your language centers are completely knocked out, you can still do arithmetic problems and you can still solve logical problems, which means there is a mechanism in the brain that is non-linguistic, that creates some kind of logic. And I think for a lot of people who've experienced trauma of any kind, they feel like they've said all they can. They've told the story a million times, they've got to the point, but they still have a non-linguistic memory that is stored, that has become the takeover learning mechanism from language. So I feel like the way I relate to your use of the word fields, like when people are in that field, is that once you use language as some kind of mechanism to reach the trauma, the experience of the trauma is multidimensional. It's not just language based. It's also, the logic is stored outside of language. And if the logic is stored outside of language, when you get to that body place where you feel some effect of the trauma, your understanding doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to be in language. I think if you can make contact with the logic, then you begin to become informed by being present with what it is. And I think when the past is brought to the present, and the present you are now awake to the past in the moment, then being able to be in that illuminated moment with someone, I think like yourself, where you can just be with what that is and begin to understand the non-linguistic dimensions of this, I think to me makes sense, because I think it does not help to expect that the trauma is going to be solved by a linguistic process only.
Yeah, completely agree with this. That sounds very right. Also, given the experience of seeing so many processes, that seems very right. And sometimes even in a non-verbal resonance field, a lot of healing happens without any words or linguistics or and interesting. I sometimes, and I'm as curious how you look at this, like because we can see language as, in a way, like zip filing an inner experience. So you have an inner experience, you put it in words, you make a zip file, and then you communicate it. And then the other person needs to open the zip file. And often the zip file gets only into the cognitive, like we listen to this mentally. But so I find it very interesting, and that's another question I have for you, because I'm exploring how actually trauma is like stored in the language patterns already that conditioned us. Because if trauma is a thousands of years old process, so then certainly parts of our language will be like encoded trauma. And so when we talk to each other in certain ways, some of it is maybe alive and coherent and congruent information, and some of it is maybe stored trauma data that is being communicated in that way because it has been normalized, like the word Google. If you Google something 40 years ago, if somebody had said, Srini, can you Google this? You said, what? And today you're Googling something because we have that meaning. But I'm wondering what are all the trauma packages that are part of our language patterns that freeze in a way part of the transmission of trauma, like it locks it because it becomes an unconscious language pattern in the language. And so I'm interested in these two things. One is the zip filing, like what does it mean that I receive you in my body and in my emotions and in my mind equally? Like I really feel what you see, what you say, and how you experience whatever your reality. And as much as I can participate, it's a kind of a holistic process, or it's just a mental process without a participation in the deeper richness of what that means for you. So that's one. And the other one is how language became like an encoded trauma information already. So I'm wondering how you look at it from your experience.
I think at a number of different levels. So I think the idea that of the zip file is true even literally. So I think we know that memories become compressed into compressed files, and we sometimes call this gist-based reasoning. So just the gist of it gets stored. A lot of times you can have a lot of inaccurate information by having one gist with another gist and another gist, and you miss out on the details, so you don't really have an accurate understanding. But sometimes gist-based reasoning is helpful for intuition, because you don't have to go into every analysis of every detail. You're like, oh, yeah, I remember that felt kind of bad, that felt kind of bad, that felt kind of bad, so it's probably going to be bad. And so it can help either way. So compressed files, I think we think can help or hurt. I think the idea of how to receive what you're in front of, for me, it's always an experimental process. Like, I think, and I notice for myself that when I am receiving someone, I feel like I want to make sure that because I don't know that I believe that giving and receiving are two things separated by time. In fact, I think they're not. And I'm not even sure if giving and receiving exists. So there's a part of me that says, for us to understand this interchange, we break it up into two. But that's an odd way of understanding. Like sometimes if there's a relatedness, like in the microcosm of you and me, this is the microcosm, but the macrocosm is the whole world that is connected. And anyone who is looking at this is participating in this conversation and hopefully giving and receiving in this whole dynamic. So I just want to say that I'm not sure if giving and receiving are really separate mechanisms. I actually think a lot of human suffering comes from talking about giving and receiving. So, for example, people will say, well, what am I going to get from this relationship?
Right.
It's like, what is going on here? Like, that almost never leads to happiness. People are always saying, well, you've got to make sure you get something. Like, what am I getting from this? Yeah, I mean, logically, I understand something about that, but I also think that when you're in a transactional relationship, the problem is not the morality of the transaction necessarily. It's that you extract yourself from flow and you extract yourself from entirety. And when you deliberately kill the collective, then it's like me to you, you to me to you to me. Then your whole life is a staccato exchange. There isn't any kind of flow that's going back and forth. So I think the first thing is, well, if I'm receiving compressed memories and I am trying to give back, I think my view is, and I'm gonna get a little esoteric here, but my view is I think as my meditation practice has evolved, and as you know, I initially resisted speaking to you because I told you I was somewhere between martinis and meditation.
Right.
But it's not changed. So I think, uh, so I felt like, but as my meditation practice has evolved, and maybe my martini practice as well, but I think as they both evolved, I have felt like both incredibly engaged by how much of my body has, I've been thinking, and actually I'm working on a bunch of stuff around this right now, around trying to understand some of the chakra oriented systems and the Kabbalistic systems and where these nodes of energy are and what's in the head and what's outside the head. But in all of this thinking, what I have been trying to understand is there are times when you are receiving compressed information, when it is so powerful in your body that you're not really sure what is going on in your body or how to respond to it, and you don't want to freak the other person out. So you're sort of like, you're like, oh my God, I feel so elevated by this experience. I don't know, but at some point it's like, well, how can you moderate that expression so the other person doesn't misinterpret you, or so that they get as much as they need to get? Because if they're coming to see you for you to help them, you don't want to overwhelm them with your response to their entirety. And then when that happens, it's an interesting navigation. How you navigate through that process. Because I find sometimes if I'm receiving someone and I'm not moderating how I'm doing this, sometimes it will take over my entire being, and I'll be there and I'll think, for me it's very pleasant, but if it's that pleasant for me, it's not always pleasant for the other person, because they're feeling like, why is this person so taken by what this is, like what I'm saying? So I think in dealing with our own traumas and in receiving information about other people's traumas, there is some kind of tempering or navigational process that occurs. I don't believe it is best done in the form of overt control. I find it is best done as a reflection. So for me, it's mostly an experience, and later on I reflect on what might have been a problem about something, or where I might have misinterpreted something. So I feel when I hear people about their compressed files, I feel like it is possible to completely misinterpret someone by only hearing something cognitively. I think it is preferable to both feel like someone is receiving you with their body, and to yourself receive other people with the body as well. Mostly because I think when you move from only cognition to cognition and emotion to cognition and emotion and somatic, you are not only involving more brain regions, but you are feeling a whole sense of integration, that you are also going to allow yourself to mirror into the other person's being. So they start to feel integrated because you're integrated. It's like if you're watching a figure skater and the figure skater is looking beautiful, suddenly you feel like, oh my God, like you feel great because your mirror neurons are activated. Similarly, when you are with someone who is receiving that in an integrated form, you have the opportunity to heal through that integration. And so I think the more we can provide that feeling of integration, I think the better. However, I would say that in everything I say, one of the reasons I say I both believe and don't believe anything I say is that I feel like there are paradoxes in everything I say, because I'm like, if you ask me, does the body exist? I would say, yeah. I mean, at a perceptual level, it exists. But how it exists, I don't really know. I mean, think about this for a second. If you think about the visual environment around us, we have access to unlimited, even now, you know, there's a white flower, there's you, there's your facial expression, there's every facial muscle, there's the green plants, the gray chair, the gray, there's so much information. But my eye can only process 10 to the 10 bits per second. By the time it goes down to the optic nerve, it's degraded even further. By the time it goes to my brain, it's 100 bits per second, which means I have a very visually impoverished understanding of the world. And the way we make meaning in the world is not just from perception. There is a self circuit in the brain which codes for self-awareness, self-regulation. And what's so very interesting about it is it also codes for what we call mentalizing, which is being able to understand things from another person's point of view. Which means in the brain, the self and the other are connected. So when we are othering, what we are doing is we are chopping the self circuit up. And we feel fragmented because when we separate ourselves from someone else, we are affecting the brain circuit that codes for self. Paradoxically, the brain circuit that codes for self also codes for other. So I think that when we are fully taking in what someone is saying, and we are coding for ourselves and the other simultaneously, is when the richest opportunity for healing occurs. When the more split off we are from other people, like we're like, I don't take your point of view. You know, I'm going to write against your point of view. I don't like what you're saying. I don't. The more we get into this othering stance, the greater the trauma, just biologically, because we have said, you do not belong to my self circuit, even though you do belong. Like everyone you encounter in your life lives in your brain. So they live in your brain. They are already there. They are part of your brain. So you can try to say, you're not part of my brain. But, you know, you can do this in gender. You can do it in race. You can do it in religion. You can say, no. What I am is I am only me. Like let's take a fairly neutral thing, right? So male. Say, well, no, I'm only male. Well, then where are all the females in your life? Well, they're living in your brain tissue. Well, if the females are living in your brain tissue, then they must be influencing your brain tissue. So you must also have some aspect of femininity in your actual body, because you are just saying I am male because you're identifying with your organs and how you come across and what you understand your genes to be. If you have females in your mind, then you're like, well, I guess my body does have females in it. Same thing with black, with white, Democrat, Republican, Trump, non-Trump. I think it's very scary for people when they realize that in some way, one possible reality is that the whole world lives in us, and we live in anyone we encounter as well. And it is kind of an amazing thing, right? It's like when I see you, for example, I've seen you in person on occasion, and then I see you online. Now, when I see you, you are in my brain. When we are separate, you are still in my brain. And I may not be remembering you, but you are still in my brain. Now, when I see you, first I have a compressed file, like your name, the context, then it starts opening up. Now I'm not only seeing you, I have the memory of what it is like to be in your actual presence. So it might seem like I'm only interacting with you online, but I'm interacting with you online and the memory of what it is to be when you are present. So to me, and then it's like, well, you are separate from me in the sense that you are on my computer screen, but you are also not separate from me, because for me to see you, you have to be on my retina. And to be in my retina, for me to actually see, you have to be in my occipital cortex. So I think you live on the screen, but actually you live in my retina, you live in my occipital cortex. It's the same thing with anyone who's watching. So all of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute, where are you? Are you on the screen? Are you on my retina? Are you in my occipital cortex? Or are you all over my brain? Because all of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute, Thomas is on the screen, but actually in my occipital cortex. Now he gives me a certain feeling. He must also be in my amygdala. Wait a minute, but the amygdala also communicates down my neck into the rest of my body. So where's Thomas? He has become an electrical activation that is now not only in my brain, but throughout my entire body. Is Thomas on the screen, or is he in my brain, or in my right hand, or where is he? Well, he's everywhere. Is he only there? Well, I don't know. He's in your voice. Where's your voice? It's not in my body only. It's between my body and the computer. Oh, so Thomas is also here. So is he here, or on the screen, or in your brain? It's like he's a non-local phenomenon. Like he is in your brain. He is an electrical activation and an image. On the screen, he is an image. In someone else, he might be a voice. It's like, what is he? He's a multi-dimensional reality that is non-local. Now we start to get into the notion that if you are a multi-dimensional reality that can occur simultaneously in a non-local world, all of a sudden we're realizing the nature of the interaction is not just one-to-one. And I am aware, because of your sphere of influence, because of my sphere of influence, because of what's happening in the world, that this non-local reality is also going to present itself to anyone who's listening to this. And if someone is listening to this and we are in their minds, how can I say I am only here? I am in their minds too. And if they write, then all of a sudden they will be in my mind. So, we can try very hard to deny that we are collective. But physiologically, the networks of connections are pretty undeniable. It's a very connected universe at a physiologic level.
With many of the ancient mystical teachings, like it's exactly what you're saying now, that we are existing. It's lovely also to just have this now, everybody who is listening, and we are kind of like in so many brains, we are. So I think that really challenges the notion of that hyper individualistic hypnosis, like that we are objects in space, more like, as you said, this multi-dimensional existence or this non-local existence. And I find it interesting what actually happens. And here is something again out of my experience in the groups, and then maybe because I think that fits very well. Because when we look at collective trauma, of course, we're looking at collective trauma because of the amount of fragmentation that you said, this cut-off loop that we other and we externalize and we are not me and this is none. But when we look at it deeper, then actually when we come together and we notice that kind of multidimensional existence, we notice that we happen in each other's brain. We notice that actually myth like professional distance are not being kept by doing this, they're being kept by relating, not by separating. Because if the patient in the hospital is in the doctor's brain, so the professional distance can only be maturity, mature relation, not any kind of I think that's very interesting. How do many healthcare professionals, also like yourself, like or everybody who works with people in crisis situations and traumatic situations, like the trauma of the patient or client happens in every healthcare, in every nurse, in every doctor, in every social worker, in every paramedic. The trauma, the pain is happening already somewhere inside. That's also another topic maybe to talk about. But what I wanted to say is my experience is if with certain ingredients of making exactly what you said more present in the room. I have seen rooms with a lot of people become so attuned to the fact that Srini and Thomas, because now we are talking here, in everybody's brain, and everybody's brain participating in us and being in our brain actually becomes a very conscious process. And that's where I think that that's the essence of collective healing. And that's also the essence of how to heal the collective fragmentation. And I'm wondering, because what you said now for me is like, it's a very essential piece of interrelatedness. And I think that dispels somehow like some of the myths of the last, I don't know, centuries of this individualized separateness. And so I would love to hear your take on this kind of collective healing fields if we make exactly what you said right now more present in the room, that's actually happening right now as we speak, and we become more aware of that interrelatedness and interdependence or co-emergence, or there are many ways how to describe that.
Yeah, so there are lots of different, I think, perspectives to what you're asking. My first reflection is on a study that looked at what distinguishes a leader in a group of people. And the study was in Harvard Business Review, and that I actually wrote about it in Harvard Business Review, but it was a scientific study that basically said that because they attached EEG electrodes to people's minds in small groups, and they tried to see, can you predict from the brainwave patterns who the leader was going to be? Although you could tell who the leader was going to be, 7 out of the 9 people you were able to tell, the most reliable predictor was those people who synchronized their EEGs with followers. So if you go into a room with the intention to synchronize, within 23 seconds, you will be identified as the leader. And they were able to tell who initiated that intention to synchronize. So that's an interesting idea, because I think it relates to, well, then how do you achieve brain synchrony? In that study, they talked about language and listening and careful listening and being able. But one way that I approach that is through the lens, the biological lens that parallels what Daniel Siegel has talked about, which is that synchrony can be achieved through 3 dimensions: presence, wholeness, and resonance. That presence is about activating my mirror neurons, so I'm open to reflecting the diversity of opinion that is all around me. It's also your point of view neurons. So not only do I see you and are you reflected in my brain as a mirror, but I try to see, if I put myself as a movie camera behind you, what I think is, oh, let me start thinking about who you are talking to, so I can start to say things that will be relevant to them rather than just relating to you as a mirror. So now I have 2 systems of neuron activated. I have my neurons activated. I have mirror neurons, which are mirroring you, point of view neurons that are looking from behind you at who you're talking to. And and then the third thing is the intention to synchronize activates, it expands the social awareness regions in the brain. So now your brain is not just conceiving of itself as separate from the others. It has become socially integrated and interpersonally integrated with the other. And that's what the presence part is. The wholeness has to do with activating the self circuit, which also contains the other, which happens through mind wandering or reverie, sort of the way in which we're doing this. Like, we don't plan this conversation. We're just going to see where our minds wander to. And then with the way I experience it, we have points of convergence and divergence. It's like, suddenly we're talking about everybody and everybody's brains, and the convergence is huge. Then we go back into another question. Then we come back to, well, now, so as we're wandering, we're not attaching to some preconceived notion of something. We're feeling into each other's fields of consciousness. And for me, what's relevant in this conversation is who and where are the consciousnesses of the people you are responsible for interacting with when you are in this healing process. And so their consciousnesses are hypothetically already in mine. So because my mind is wandering to that in yours. So now I have a sense of wholeness, because first I was me, then I was me with you. Now I am me with you and everyone you talk to. And I realize that if everyone you talk to is listening to both of us, then we will all be a system. So wholeness is when your mind wanders, you're able to realize these different connections. And resonance is as simple as, can actually be created by walking in tandem or drum beats together, or any kind of physical movement allows you to trust someone more and even remember them better. So these three dimensions of presence, wholeness, and resonance, I think really accentuate collective awareness. And collective awareness is interesting because it's also non-local, right? It's not just that I am aware of you. I don't know who's aware of who here. Someone is aware of something somewhere, and there is no subject or object. Once you lose the subject and object, you come to a state of consciousness, which I think is very remarkable. Meher Baba talks about this when he talks about the lover and the beloved. And he says that throughout our lives, the lover is always looking for the beloved, until the lover realizes that the beloved was always in the lover, in which case the beloved will start to relax, the lover will start to relax. But before that, there's a lot of pain because you're trying to get the beloved into you, and you realize, I can't do this. Suddenly you're like, oh, wait a minute, this person I'm trying to get into me, like I am the lover and the beloved. The other person is the lover and the beloved. When you come to each other as the lover and the beloved, you are no longer desiring. And desire is a mechanism to destroy the collective, because it means that there's a desirer and an object of desire. It's not that desire is bad. Desire is whatever it is. But when you desire something, you are saying, I am separate from you. And in order for us to have what we desire, we have to give up desire, so that what we want is no longer an object that is separate from us, which means it is who we are. And what a profound realization to recognize that what we want is who we are. That who we are is in the presence of someone else, not even located to our bodies, but that our consciousness is far and wide. And I think it becomes difficult for a lot of people, when they realize, like, they don't mind feeling connected to people they like. But when you see people you don't like, it becomes it's like, they can keep their consciousness. I don't want their consciousness in mine. It's going to contaminate. And I think it's human, to feel that, like, when you see someone, you're like, oh, they're going to throw me off a little. I'd rather not go there. But what I find is, I think I saw this a lot when I worked with sociopaths, for example. Like, people would say to me, oh my God, I don't even want to work with that person. They're scumbags, they're terrible. But you get into the world and you realize that they live in a world that appears to be unfeeling, because there's no way. They sometimes have so much processing of the world that they don't know how to. It is a failure of processing, of too much stimulation, and they cut it off and they're like, I don't care about anything. So when you work with them long term, you realize that you help them to develop the sense of self-trust. And when they have a sense of self-trust, they can start to trust others. I find with a lot of people I work with, when you do not trust yourself implicitly, it is almost impossible to trust anyone else. And you live in a state of perpetual trauma when you cannot trust yourself. And for me, trusting myself does not mean I'm always right. I mean, that's the opposite of what I am. Like, I feel like I'm wrong far more than I'm right. So if I use that as a criterion, would not suit me. But I think for me, self-trust has to do with the fact that we're here on earth in this form for as long as we know we are. And there is a process of discovery that is possible. And for me, humility is not about like saying, oh, well, I don't know. And that's it. Humility is just a natural state of overwhelm that I feel I am perpetually in. Like, there's no option but to be like, I don't know. As I said, I don't know what's happening most of the time. But not knowing what is happening is a way of being open to what's happening. And when you are open to what's happening, then suddenly the world is, everything in the world can come to you. Yeah, I'm interested to know how you, I guess, how you receive that, and to what extent you think, like, if someone were listening to this and thinking, well, they're speaking about the collective and they're speaking about my personal pain. Do you think pain is personal? Or do you think if you feel pain in your own body and you feel pain in your own mind, is it only in your own mind and your own body, or is it collective as well, do you think?
Mm. No, in my understanding, it's both. It's like definitely collective as well, and I see the great chance of healing is if we, because we see this very often that the contraction makes it appear personal, like the trauma contraction and the numbness and the fragmentation. It seems in that it seems it's compartmentalized in somebody, but we also see if I often say also in our training programs, if I allow myself to really participate in anybody's pain and I'm really willing to be there, the light is like awareness is coming into that level of pain equally. So there is something about like this, like the same as you said about the kind of non-local existence that we are, like the same is true for the pain too. Through the contraction, it seems like it's sitting somewhere in my body, it's really painful, it's my pain, but actually if somebody comes that deeply feels me and participates in my experience, I've seen this thousands of times, there's this melting, and if it's a true attention, it's not just a politically correct, I don't want to feel your pain, but I know it's good if I'm with you, you know, then that's not really working. But if I'm truly participating, then I become aware of that part in myself, we could say, that is painful in you, because it's also happening in me. Like your pain is same happening in my brain, like you are happening in my brain. So that's why it's a shared database. Like we are all sitting in a shared cloud, like a cloud computing. And I often say, like humanity is like a supercomputer that animated laptops on the screens. You know, like you imagine you have a supercomputer, many screens, and then there is an animated laptop, and the supercomputer identified with the laptop on its own screen. And so, like this, we are walking around thinking now we are this kind of small laptop, when in fact we are that supercomputer that has like it's one supercomputer. That's why I love your, like the way you spoke about it. It's very lovely, because I deeply experience this to be true, and I see this in the healing work to be true. That separation, once we and it also means that there is there's the level of not knowing, there's the level of presence and openness, but there's also some kind of courage that's involved in, I often call it, are we willing to make a step and the floor appears when we put down our foot? Like not knowing is like making a step and you don't know if there is a floor. The floor appears when you make that step into something unknown. And I think that that's also part of creation, that sometimes we make these steps into places where we don't know if there's going to be a floor, but the territory of humanity is being increased. And that's also when we link it back to the Bible, like when it says that on the sixth day of creation God created the human being, but this is the sixth day. It's not that it happened in the past and now we're walking around in the game board and we're finding out how to come to the end of the game, but we are literally, it's happening through us as we are exploring this. And that's why I find it interesting also as a scientific question is, like, are we finding stuff out about the world that exists and we are just finding out more about it, or since yesterday more has been created and that also adds to what we are finding out? Is science an ever-increasing database that is being created, and some of the things, they haven't existed yesterday. And some of the things have existed and we couldn't see them or we couldn't understand them. And that's a little bit, that also I believe belongs to the conversation that we are having here.
No, I mean, it resonates on a number of levels. I think the first piece that you talked about was the supercomputer and the laptop. I think one way I like to think about that is, for me, the metaphor that grounds it is the way we think about bodies. Everybody talks about the gut-brain relationship, and they're like, oh my God, really? Like, if you change your gut bacteria, you can change your brain? Like, why is this such a astounding phenomenon? Like, it's sort of like there was a sperm and there was an ovum, and they came together, they formed one cell. At the beginning of your literal life, everything was one cell. Then it divided and became a head and a foot, and suddenly everything became separate, but it was originally all the same thing. It became differentiated. So at a literal level, your brain came from the same cell. Your right toe came from the same cell. So the mind-body connection, they were always connected. So it was always connected. It was always one. And knowing the wholeness, like, you wouldn't say, hi, my name is Srini and I have a liver. It's like, oh, really? Is that all you are? Well, I also have a spleen. And I also have a kidney. And it's like, well, what is that? It's like, I have all these different organs together. And then, that's where you start. And you start to understand, well, okay, there is some kind of entirety where I need to bring my consciousness to. But you are implicit in what you're saying, which resonates with me very deeply, is the idea of how the flow appears when you put your foot forward. Because it's never there when you don't. Like, when you sit there, you can say, well, maybe, I'm waiting for the floor to come. I don't know if it's going to come. Right. You'll never innovate your whole life. Right. So, I don't know what to do. Or if you go expecting the worst, into a relationship, for example, you're like, okay, I'm going to take the plunge. I'm just going to start this relationship now. But you're cringing. The littlest stimulation is going to be like, oh my God, I hate this relationship. It's just like my other relationship. It's like putting your hand on something that is not hot, but you're like, it's hot. And you put your hand and something distracts you and you're like, oh, it's hot. But someone is like, no, it's not hot. Put your hand back in and you put it in and you're like, no, this is going to burn. Or if you put your toe in water and you're like, it's too cold. You withdraw. It's like, keep it there for a while and you'll see you'll get used to it. And then you do. But I feel like what you're saying, if you ask me about like a development in myself since we last talked, this thing about stepping out and then finding the floor has been such a delight. Like, I now realize that the fact that the flow always appears, it just always appears, no matter what. And it appears in part because of my own intolerance of being without gravity all the time. Like, it's sort of like If I could just float into space, it probably would be fine. I'd find another way of navigating the space. But there are times when I'm like, okay, I'm tired, I just need to land. And then you land and you're like, oh, there's a floor. Like, so I think that the development of the self is accentuated through curiosity and exploration. In part because as you are exploring into these other zones where you are afraid there's no floor, you start to understand that the self is an ever expanding, ever evolving thing, like you were pointing to at the end of that discussion. And once you understand that you are this ever evolving, ever expanding thing, it's an amazing way to live, right? Like you suddenly start thinking, oh, so like anything is possible. Like there is, people always say, oh, well, that's not very likely. It's like, well, I'm not saying it's likely. It is, many of the amazing things we want in life are not likely because it's not likely we're going to move out of our stuckness. But if we move out of our stuckness, they are possible. And so once you start going into those zones, like I often ask myself, as I'm sure many people are, like, when I think about many of the innovative projects I've started, for example, some of them have come to completion, some of them have not. And I'm always asking myself, well, at some point you look for receptivity. So for example, I decided recently a movie director I really like is John Cassavetes, who was this guerrilla film director. He made everything from a shoestring budget, but like beautiful movies. And there's something about him as a character. He was so intolerant of mediocrity. He was just sort of like, I hate it, I don't like this. I want everything to be like full human scene. And so I've been looking at Cassavetes over and over again. He's an incredible source of inspiration. But there's something about what he's talking about, which is like taking a chance to be who you are. It's not just about taking a risk. He reminds you that you have this one life to live. And so let's say we know that there is collective consciousness, and we know there is collective healing. And we know that if you take a step out, you will find the floor. And you know that at some point, the nature of your being is to be ever expanding. That's a large kind of trust to live in. But I feel like rather than substantiating it and backing it up and backing it up and backing it up, logic is not the best support. Like it just isn't. It supports what's logical. But logic cannot support what's not logical. And we have many things in our brains that are not logical. In fact, probably most of it is not logical. So if you want to live a logical life, you'll turn to logic. But if you want non-logical things like love, like connection, like the experience of being, you can be like, well, you turn to logic. Logic is like, what? Show me step A, step B. Otherwise, I don't know what that is. And it's like, well, no, logic it's like a backbone, a basic architecture, but you have to still spread your wings and fly. And I think if you only rely on that spinal column of logic, you'll just be walking your whole life. But it's this non-logical part of ourselves that allows us to spread our wings and allows us to go to different places. Mm. So for me, in the brain, understanding that our brains are coded and are made for logical and non-logical processes, that there is a whole way in which you can, aspiration, what do I wish for? Inspiration, what moves me? Imagination, what could be? These are all things, the default mode network in the brain can conduct these things. But what people do is, we have two basic systems in the brain. We have many systems, but if you look at this one dimension, you have the lateral cortex on the outside, the logical part of the brain. And if you split the brain down the middle, you have a number of different regions called the default mode network. That's where possibility lives. That's where imagination lives. That's where the idea of a better future lives. If you stick in the logical brain, you're only on the outside. So to move to the center part of the brain, you have to ask, what is possible? And what is possible? And some people are, oh no, that's not possible. Well, why? Because it's not real. It's not real from the beginning. Possibility is not something that is not yet in reality. It's like if you look at flour, it's not a cake yet, but you'll need it to bake the cake. So you can't leave out the possible to make this phenomenal life. And so to activate possibility, you have to spend time outside of this rational cortex in the space of imagination. It's why Einstein revered imagination. It's why I think most people, he described his theory of relativity as a musical experience because it came out of the sense of possibility. A lot of logical thoughts, and they feed into the sense of possibility, but we have to turn the possibility network on. And what's funny about this is that the possibility network is pretty much identical for the most part with the self network. And the self network is pretty much identical with the other network. So now you're saying possibility, self, and other are connected. And that is why the potential for healing exists in the collective space.
That's fantastic. It's so beautiful. Because that's also how I look at the self. It's a kind of a flow, and it's not inside and outside. It's inside and outside, and future and past, and it's all like it's a fluid. It's a fluid it's a relatedness, and that's very beautiful. It's fantastic as the way you said it, and maybe like I have so many so many directions where, like I'm interested to go, like, but maybe to boil it down to two. Like one is because you said beautifully, like everything came out of this one cell. And then if we extend that and if we say now, oh wow, but that sperm and the egg wanted to live, they came from a body, and they came out of one cell, and they came out of one cell, and they came out of one cell, and they so when I look at my body, I basically, because I'm always saying my body is not whatever, almost 50 years old, but my body is hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years old. So the life wanted to live already for a long time. And somehow this lifeline is alive right now. It's alive in me, it's alive in you. How many things needed to go the way they went in order for us to have this conversation? And I often say, like, life gave the few generations that are alive right now the life like handed over the whole achievements of humanity until now, or whatever, how we want to see it with the past and the future. But let's leave it just simple. Like all these hundreds of thousands of years, somebody hands you over this supercomputer and saying, make the best out of it. It's now in your hands. And it's fantastic if you see, for example, healing also. How many people got hurt on the way here to this conversation? And how many people got healed? So that the self-healing mechanism in my body is an accumulation of so many lifetimes learning how to heal itself. And I think that it's wonderful if we that's why I call it sometimes a forelation, like that relation is actually, if you take it this way, inside, outside, future, and past, it's like a cross. And the self is in a way the modulation of the whole directions of information. It's actually at least four, if you make it again simple, like four directions. And so this conversation receives, as you said, the possibility of future downloads, and it also gives a voice to everything that has been learned until now as kind of structures of consciousness that have been created. All the things that you spoke about in the brain, they kind of crystallized somehow. And so I'm wondering, on the one hand, how you see this, like, for example, things like self-healing mechanism. like that the body knows how to heal itself, that here are hundreds of thousands of years of richness and wisdom, and like how we access that, like for example as a scene from the brain, and then the other, or the body, this whole experience. And then the other thing is, like, because you're like, what's so inspiring about you is, I think, the multifaceted approach to life. And when you speak a little bit about your creativity, and like this living, dreaming out of possibilities, because it seems like you're doing so many things. You're writing musical, you're writing songs, you're a neuroscientist, you work with clients, you do, like, you're designing clothes, and it's like you're exploring many of those aspects of yourself with passion. And I'm sure that every part enriches the other part. So that's also living fully means to really follow all these threads, because they all inform each other, I'm sure. So maybe these two things, just a short response to the, that the cell is actually a series of cells that has a long history. And then the creativity, and afterwards I have a final question maybe for the conversation. I mean, I could go on for hours.
I could too. I mean, I think so I think the cells being related to other cells is very interesting to me. In fact, I was thinking my next song is going to be around this theme, because there was a form of logic that's being applied to the world that I don't fully understand yet. I understand that there are ways in which we can, there are ways in which we can, like, do things like humans have been around for 200,000 years. Viruses have been around for billions of years. So whose land is this? Is the first question, right? And then, bacteria have also been around for a very long time. In fact, they've been around for so long, we think they might be part of the respiratory apparatus of our cells. They become incorporated into our cells. So the question is, if they're incorporated into our cells, what is that? Right? So from a time standpoint, this notion of ownership, I do not understand from a time standpoint. Like this notion of where we come from, firstly, I genuinely do not know. What I do know is that if we have been around for 200,000 years, then there's a question, which is, what is our relationship to bacteria? What is our relationship to viruses that precede us? And does the idea of ownership even matter? Or should we just accept that we are part of some notion of being, where, of course, the cell comes from another generation, it comes from another, and each generation feeds the other its genetics. And then when you're developing in the womb, you are also developing your sense of self. If you look at an embryo, when it is in utero, if you look at the brain, the self circuit is developing. We are making meaning before we get sensory inputs. And this meaning-making circuit stays in our brain throughout, which means some people try to only make me, well, what do I really like? Let's see. I went to school, I did this. I went to school, I did that. So on the basis of these two things, I should do that. That's one thing you can do. But if you do that, you are leaving out the spontaneous meaning-making circuit in your brain that may have nothing to do with the school you went to. And that links to my creativity, because I think my creativity is an expression of a certain kind of joy that I feel able to access in the world. And I have to say, this joy did not come from pure joy only. I feel like there was a time in my life where I felt it as intense pain, a lot of ruptures of attachments, disappointments, that kind of thing. You evolve through different stages in life. And then I think through all of those periods, you feel that the creative impulse can emerge. And the creative impulse is very connected. Like an example would be, one of the reasons I love Cassavetes is the only thing he was interested in was love. He only made movies about love. That was all he was interested in. And recently I was trying to have a kind of, like how can I advance my, like, what am I really interested in? And I thought, I'm kind of this, I mean, I'm really only interested in love. I don't find anything else that interesting. And so I thought, I'm going to start a line to my business that's going to be about helping companies brand themselves through the lens of love. And I'm just going to see if we can create. So I created this whole structure around, the history of love in Greeks and what happens in the brain when you love, and love through pop music and love through. And I was, people were like, "Oh, that sounds a little crazy. Like, how are you going to go to a corporation and say, would you like to redefine yourself through love?" On the day, I just started that. The next day, I had a conversation with someone who I joke around. She's a very practical woman. So she said, "Well, what have you been thinking about?" And I said, "I've just been thinking about love. And I'm really only interested, I'd like to interact only with companies that want to redefine themselves as love." That's really funny you're saying this, because the company you just spoke to about resilience, they are actually redefining their brand in terms of love. And so they're looking for someone who can help them think about, about love. And I thought, here I was playing. I was just playing. I was like, oh, this is play. I put together a PowerPoint for myself. Took all this time. There was zero money associated with it. No market, no customer, like nothing. And then I put it together, and it was like, well, sometimes if you build it, they will come. Sometimes when you're ready to be you, then the world will see. But if you pretend not to be you, the world is also not seen. And for me, that is a lifelong process of continuously trying to engage those parts of myself that I feel I hide. And I think when people experience trauma, and my experience of the world in general, is that it's difficult to be all of you, all of the time. And so to the extent that we can make part of life's journey some kind of self-discovery, some kind of discovery around, well, what are these different things that I am? Like, I like technology, and I love science, and I love art. And people always like, well, choose one thing. I don't want to choose one thing. This all comes from the brain. And I don't think, if people are like, oh, you must be a Renaissance man. You say, yeah, maybe. But maybe I think everybody has a brain that connects across the hemispheres. So if you have a brain that connects across the hemispheres, why wouldn't you allow it to? So I think a lot of this healing that you point out, to me, is a natural state of being. And I would also point out that there's an interesting lesson from coronavirus, which is sort of one of the causes of death, is that coronavirus actually causes a cytokine storm. So there's an over-immune response. And if there's too much of an immune response, then the body can't deal with it. So healing also has to be gentle. It's not like, I'm going to heal. I'm going to heal now. Now I must heal. I must heal. Because then you have too much immunity. Your body doesn't know what to do with it. You have to understand that there is a dialogue between the pain and the healing. And that you have too much of an immune response, it's not helpful. If you have, what we want is a match of circumstances. And I think what we're talking about fundamentally is the rhythm, right? We're talking about this. Fundamentally, we're talking about the rhythm. I think one of the things we're talking about is the rhythm of being, and the music underlying the notion of being human.
Beautiful, beautiful, lovely, lovely. It's interesting because in the moment, like, we come into a certain level of flow, which I hear you describing, and also through a process of really finding out and being in the question and the inquiry, that it's very interesting even if we look at what was first, your impulse to work with companies that are, that their message is love, or the market that you didn't know yet existed to spark that impulse. So, like, when there is a deeper and deeper coherence, we experience it as a synchronization or a synchrony. But the question is, are they separate? And I think that's very lovely when we talk about self-expression. Are we really looking for clients somewhere, or is the impulse in you and the need here one field? And that's amazing. That's amazing in terms of like many people looking for potential expression, purpose, and so on, how the one field is orchestrating it, or what is actually the higher organizing principle of that collective field. What is the higher organizing principle? That's an interesting question. And the other thing, maybe to re-relate many things that we said now, that you very beautifully like wove together, is if we were to relate our conversation now, for example, to Black Lives Matter, or to kind of structural violence or racial injustice, or like very very concrete challenges that, for example, we face at the moment, globally, because it's not somewhere, it's a global question. So how would you speak to that, from like when we summarize all of this and we bring it to something that's happening right now? And it's happening. It seems like it's happening in the US, but given all we said, it's happening in all of us.
I think there are a number of conflicts all over the world right now. I think Black Lives Matter is one of them. I think the Democrats and Republicans are another. I think pro and anti-Brexit are another. I think Black Lives Matter is happening in the UK. I think there's chaos happening in Hong Kong. So there is some kind of formative impulse for polarization that is rising as a potential meaning-making instrument. And I am personally not inclined to fall for the polarization, because I think it is not as specific as we would be tempted to believe. I believe that trying to underline the underlying polarization, trying to understand that, trying to understand what that field is that is creating this, and how you would like to participate in it, is really important. I find that if I participate in the polarization by taking a stand, on the one hand, people say, well, if you take a stand and you're making a declaration, you're saying, this is what I feel. But when you take a stand, you are ignoring the system as well. You are ignoring the fact that there are people on two sides of every idea. And from where I stand, I think I feel sympathetic towards two real things. I feel sympathetic towards the absence of equal opportunity. I think where equal opportunity should exist, it should exist regardless of demographic. I feel sympathetic to the idea that unnecessary killings are unnecessary killings, and that it just is what it is. And that to me is pretty clear. There's nothing to say about that, except it should not happen, and I would be in support. I'm also not sympathetic towards violence that results in unnecessary killings. And I'm also not sympathetic to something that highlights one thing at the exclusion of another, just because it happens to be the time. So on the one hand, I feel like it is helpful to raise consciousness about this at a personal level, not because I'm right or wrong. I have no interest in violence as a solution to conflict. It's just not of interest to me. It's at a personal level, I think it's threatening. At a community level, I think it's threatening. And I have not seen it resolve that much in general. So there are times when there is some resolution. I can see how that works, but I'm just saying my personal preference is not for that. If you think about what this is in the world, I think people do not like the idea that all lives matter, because they say, but that's not the point. Of course, all lives matter, but now we're shining a light on a specific form of injustice. I think if you shine a light on the injustice, you have to look at it more deeply, and you have to be prepared to understand the multifactorial links to this. There are political advantages for certain people to focus on one thing versus another. There are financial advantages for certain people to focus on one thing versus another. There are a million variables that feed into any one system at any one point in time. So when I think about what Black Lives Matter is, the fundamental complaint, I feel, deserves full validity. I think the response to it is highly questionable in my mind. Because the rioting, while it is very understandable, I mean, human madness is not understandable. It is understandable. But I am not in favor of the idea that we cannot resolve this issue simply because we are frustrated about the longevity of it. Frustration to me is a sign that we can make an attempt at civil discourse. I don't think threatening the safety of everyone is a response that I would support personally. From the point of view of what you and I are talking about, I think if you counter the energy of polarization, then you counter it with love. And when you counter it with love, you understand that there is a whole system that can be contained. And for me, one way this, a friend of mine recently demonstrated this to me. He sent me a song by Whitney Houston in which Democrats and Republicans were holding hands because they were moved by the art of what existed. And I believe that art is a potent example in which apparently stark polarizations can lose their reality in celebration of the collective. And my preference would be that we celebrate the collective and spend energy in building that collective rather than focusing only on the trauma that existed, which is exactly where we started this conversation. And it's a question of, do you want to do hippocampal hammering? And do you want to guilt people into responding to you? Or would you like to have some form of resilience building in order to create the collective? And I would fully recognize, as I would say to anybody, that I think this is a point of view that's a preference. And it's a point of view that is continuously evolving as I understand more and gather more data. Because of what I do, I don't find human pain following demographic lines. I see rich people who want to kill themselves. I see poor people who are happy. I see white people who are sad. I see black people who are happy. I see all kinds of things. So I care. My fundamental caring is about humanity. And the selective caring on certain groups is not something that speaks to my heart. I would rather contribute to a global energy that is about elevating the state of being rather than celebrating the polarization.
And like now that you spoke, really the last question is, when you said that around the globe there is this polarization phenomena, is there any deeper insight what that polarization phenomenon is trying to surface around the world?
I mean, I have lots of thoughts about it. I think one idea is, like, I think a lot of people would say this has to do with, it's an economic issue, and because there's so much economic polarization, everything that we're seeing is a result of this economic divide. I'm pretty certain that that factors in as a real variable. But at a spiritual level, I think there's an opportunity here to look at the collective. It's like when Meher Baba says the lover and the beloved are the most intense pain when they are so separate that they cannot come together. Then we have an opportunity to ask, what is the thing that can bring us together? So I feel like what the internet has done is it has allowed us to experience ourselves in non-local ways. And I think we've overestimated the extent to which consciousness can accommodate the non-local existence of what it is to be human. And this, I think a lot of the chaos we are experiencing is a chaos in which consciousness has not caught up to the capabilities for connection. And one of the reasons I deeply respect the work that you're doing is that it is to allow human consciousness to catch up with the capability for connection.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. I think that's a fantastic final word for our conversation today. I definitely, we need to talk more, Srini. I'm very excited about many things that we talked about today. Thank you very much for this contribution. It was again like a roller coaster through the cosmos and back. And thank you. It's really beautiful, and also it's lovely to see you weaving many things together, and how science and art are very kind of fluidly interwoven in the way you express it, and that's very beautiful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to just to be with the people who are with you as well. I deeply appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.